Hi guys, it's Crystal. I hope you guys are all doing well today and that you're out there enjoying the sunshine and that you've had a good week so far. If you're new to my channel, like I said, my name's Crystal and I do Canadian true crime or true crime with a Canadian twist. I know you guys are going to ask, then what am I doing Ted Bundy for? Because from time to time I do international crimes as well, just to switch things up and to show how offenders are caught in other nations and what happens to them, things of that nature. But I also do requests. So if there is a case that you guys want me to talk about, particularly if it's a Canadian case, just let me know and I'll see what I can do. The international cases I usually do like every other month, once every couple months, and I do have a couple more planned for this year. So if that sounds like something that you guys want to hear, please hit the old like button, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the notification bell that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, and leave me a comment. If you guys are going to leave a comment though, please no hate. We're just here to talk about things. We don't need to spread hate, give theories, give ideas, things of that nature. And if you guys are returning subscribers, you guys already know how much I love you and how thankful I am that you guys choose to watch my videos on wherever you watch them and on whatever device. These videos are for entertainment or educational purposes only as well, guys, because I know that YouTube wants me to say that. So not too much of an introduction, guys. You already know this is Ted Bundy, the final chapter. We are finishing it today. I don't know how much more I can take of Ted Bundy. It's been 4 straight weeks. I think I've written over 100 pages. I think if you guys add these videos together and if you were to watch them in tandem, it would probably end up being 6 hours. So we've definitely covered Ted Bundy. Oh, and today I am wearing an iconic movie shirt. I don't know if you guys remember this movie or if you guys have watched it. If you haven't, watch it. It's The Sandlot. It's about the great American pastime, right? Baseball. Plus Ham was one of my favorite characters. So there you go. So when we last left Ted Bundy, guys, he just escaped again from Colorado. He'd already escaped previous to that. He was finally up for murder charges in the case of Karen Campbell, right, from Aspen, Colorado. And Colorado was quickly putting together other cases, as was Utah. Washington had cases, but theirs lacked the evidence that they need. In fact, most of these cases, guys, until you get to Florida, pretty much circumstantial. They had specific things linking him to the cases, obviously credit card receipts, knowing that he was in the area at that point in time, the descriptions, things of that nature. I mean, he used his own name, but with the cases in Washington, it was more or less stalling out. They figured they would never get to try him in Washington, but they knew he was good for the crimes. He had escaped once already and was gone for about 6 days. And the final escape from Colorado, guys, he was in Colorado. He had already been extradited there and had had his death row hearing. They weren't going to use the death penalty in Colorado. But regardless, on December 30th of 1977, he managed to sneak out, guys. He lost enough weight. He went through the ceiling, dropped down into the jailer's apartment, and just left out the open door. So while he was leaving, yeah, I know, he stole a car called an MG Midget. I don't really know a lot about cars. I know some, but I'm not familiar with this one. It was a pretty old car and it was a crap bucket, guys. Ted knew that it was going to break down at some point in time, and it did. So ironically enough, he actually then hitchhiked to Denver, Colorado. And from Denver, the outskirts of Denver, he took a cab to the airport. And from there, he got on a plane for Chicago, Illinois. When he got on the plane, it was about 11 o'clock a.m. He had about a 17-hour head start on the officers. Now, originally, when they went to go check at 7 a.m. and give him his breakfast, I don't know why they didn't call everybody out of their cells, but I guess like every jail is different, right? Ted was known to sleep longer than 7 o'clock. And he was known to not always want to have breakfast. So they didn't think that it was odd that he wasn't up yet. Plus, remember what I told you last week, that he had gone back before his final escape and stuffed some law papers underneath of his mattress. He also stacked some law books up on his mattress and like covered them over so it looked like there was somebody sleeping in there. And like I said, it's 11 a.m. now. He's on a plane to Chicago. No one is aware that he is not in prison, not even the guards at this point in time. They did not find out until it was lunchtime, and Ted was still ostensibly not up. So they went into the cell and found that it was just the law books and the papers and not Ted. So, of course, they set up roadblocks and everything like that. They had no idea what time he had actually left, and they wouldn't know until later on. But he was already so far out of town, it didn't really matter. So at that point in time, authorities knew that he wouldn't have used the same route that he used the last time he escaped, and they were correct with this, but they had no idea that he had gotten so far away. So I can't believe he just walked away from the prison. He changed clothes and just walked away. Now, you guys remember that Ted Bundy is a chameleon. I want you guys to keep remembering that. At this point in time, he was able to do whatever he wanted. It took about, like I said, 17 hours for them to even find out he was missing and then release his mugshot and put a wanted posters out. So he had almost, a day's full start on that. So from Chicago, Ted took a train to Ann Arbor, Michigan. Oh, it creeps me out. He was in Michigan. Michigan is like directly across from Windsor. And of course, you guys know I don't live that far from Windsor. So like creepy. I know Ann Arbor isn't directly across from us. We're more Detroit based, but still it's so creepy. And he was there for a couple days. He was there for long enough to actually catch the Rose Bowl game that year on television in a bar. Completely undetected, completely unknown. No one questioned anything. So he was there for a couple days. Now, there are two differing reports about how he actually got to Tallahassee. One report said that he stole a car and drove all the way to Tallahassee. Another, and that was in Anne's book. You guys remember I'm using the books, The Stranger Beside Me, for my research, and also The Phantom Prince by Liz, Ted's former girlfriend. It's hard to say what she is at this point in time, but I'm going to say she's his former girlfriend by this date. So, like I said, there's another report out there that said that Ted actually took the stolen car. He did steal a car. He took the stolen car to Atlanta, Georgia, and ditched it there, and then took a bus all the way to Tallahassee. But regardless, he did end up in Tallahassee, and that was about January 8th. Of 1978 that he arrived there. So to the other odd thing for you guys to know is that when he escaped from Colorado, numerous people were cheering him on. They knew he'd been indicted for murder, and they also knew that he was found guilty in the Carol DeRange case, but for some reason they weren't grasping how deadly Ted was, because he came across so affable, so charming. He was manipulative too, right? He just looked like an everyday guy. He was so handsome that, he had a lot of groupies at this point in time. And people were cheering him on. They were, I don't know, they were glad about his run. It's almost like they forgot what he had done and they were just, go Ted, go. This is a lot like the case when Lori Bambenek, Laurentia Bambenek, you might know her as Bambi. And they had all those shirts made, Run, Bambi, Run, except in my estimation, she was not guilty. Ted truly was. But anyway, he's down in Tallahassee now. So at this point in time, the FBI did actually contact Anne Rule because Anne was going to LA. She had another house there. I don't know if she had rented the house just for something she was doing. I know she was writing a script for a film at that point in time. It wasn't anything to do with this case. She was just working on a script at that point in time. So she was going down to LA to live there for a little while. And the FBI actually thought that Ted might try to get a hold of her. Now, of course, he wasn't in Colorado, or he wasn't in Los Angeles. He wasn't in California at that point in time. But regardless, they still wanted to look out for Anne and make sure. And the same thing happened with Liz. Oddly enough, Liz had actually talked to Ted in Christmas of 1977. He called her from jail. And they just talked for a little while. They actually talked for quite a while. And she asked him, quote, how many times have we gone through this, end quote, because he said, all I wanted to do was hear your voice one last time. It was a running joke between the two of them, so that's why she said that, and she was laughing the whole time. And Ted was dead serious. This, ostensibly, as long as things worked out for him, was going to be the last time he would be talking to Liz, so he was telling her his truth, his version of the truth at that point in time. So it was Bob Keppel himself that actually called Liz to tell her that Ted was on the run, that Ted had escaped again. And she was somewhat frightened. I know she spoke to the FBI. I think police watched her and Anne for a little while, not because they were in trouble, but because they thought Ted would try to go there. He didn't. He was miles and miles and miles away in another state. He was in Florida at that point in time. So once he got to Tallahassee, Ted rented like a room or like an apartment at a place called the Oak. This place was ostensibly like student housing. There was a lot of other students there. And you know, this is Ted's strong point. He can fit in any type of college town. And Tallahassee did have a number of colleges and universities. So he fit right in there. He's about 31 years old at this point in time, but he can still pass himself off as a student. He was just a student not that long ago. So it did make sense. He came to the place under the name Chris Hagen. That is how everybody knew him. Now, apparently when he got to Florida, he had made this list of things that he wasn't going to do anymore. He said he wasn't going to steal anymore, which he completely blew within a day. He said he wasn't going to kill anymore. He says he wasn't going to steal cars anymore, and ostensibly he was going to go out and find a job and live under the radar that way. He didn't do a whole lot to change his appearance, guys. He was extremely underweight at that point in time because of the prison break, and he'd lost a lot of muscle mass as well because he'd been in his cell for so long. All he did was cut his hair so that it wouldn't show up as wavy, right? That's what a lot of people were looking for. He did grow a mustache. He was prone to wearing turtlenecks because he actually had a birthmark on his neck, but that information was never put on any of the wanted posters. So he was okay with that. And he also used to draw like a fake birthmark on his cheek as well while he was in Tallahassee. At this point in time, because police knew that he had escaped, he was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, but nobody in the Oak knew that. They thought he was Chris Hagen. He didn't speak a lot to his neighbors, which was pretty odd for Ted Bundy. I'm pretty sure that you guys know at this point in time that Ted hated being alone. Okay, he didn't like to be lonely in any sense. Even if he was staying by himself, he liked to be able to talk to his neighbors. He liked to be able to call people on the phone. And of course, at this point in time, he had to lay low. It didn't bother him to a large extent at this point in time. He was affable to his neighbors. He talked to them, but just in very little spurts. He didn't tell them a lot of information other than the fact that he was a student and his name was Chris Hagen. He probably said he went to Florida State University. Regardless, nobody really dug into anything. He pretty much kept to himself at that point in time. Now, while he was there, he figured he needed a new identity, and he dug through the old graduate records at Florida State University and found the name Kenneth Meisner. This guy had been an athlete at the school, so Ted took on the persona of Kenneth Meisner, and he actually had ID printed up in the name Kenneth Meisner, as well as various other ones, but he did have Kenneth Meisner as his ID. So while he's at the Oak, he's Chris Hagen. Everywhere else, he's Kenneth Meisner. And he figured he could get, you know, the rest of the ID and everything else that he would need. Other pieces of identification, I should say, not just licenses and stuff. He figured he could get that later on. He also didn't interact as much with his neighbors because he didn't want to have to create a backstory at that point in time for what Chris Hagen was doing here. It would just be too much for him. And of course, like I said, even though he claimed he wasn't going to steal, he immediately started stealing things to furnish his apartment. He was also stealing credit cards at this point in time to pay for these things. Everything was okay at that point in time, but it's not going to stay that way, guys. So, like I said, he had actually moved to Tallahassee, Florida by January 8th of 1978. And by January 14th, he could no longer fight the urges to kill. They were just too extreme within him at this point in time. He had spent all that time in prison. It had been building up in him during that time. Because if you remember, when he was striking in 74 and 75, it was almost like one a month. He was doing it in extraordinary ways. So it makes sense that the urge had built so much within him. But at this point in time, guys, he's no longer organized. He's not an organized killer. He has to live by his wits and stay under the radar, right? Right? He's a wanted man. They know he's a wanted man. So he needs to keep attention off of him. But at the same point in time, he cannot fight this urge. And he doesn't want to. He doesn't really care, right? So the Chi Omega House was a sorority for the most beautiful, the most popular, and the smartest girls on campus. Most of the girls that lived at the Chi Omega House, particularly on the night of January 14th, had been out at various parties or clubs. There was keggers going on campus. Do they still call them keggers? Maybe you guys could maybe let me know. I'm not sure, like beer bus, keggers, keg parties. There was a bunch of them going on campus. There was also various clubs on campus, and the girls had gone out that night to party. Most of them had gone out that night to party, and most of them were in various states of intoxication, guys. It's an important point to note because this is likely why no one actually heard what happened at the Chi Omega House that night. I do want to let you guys know there was a houseboy of sorts. That's what Anne Rule referred to him as. I'm not sure what that means. Maybe he just did errands for them or was like a mascot for them of sorts. His name was Ronnie Eng, and he was the only one that was actually allowed upstairs that was male. No other males were ever allowed upstairs in the sorority. So Margaret Bowman was 21 on this night. She was the daughter of a prominent family from St. Petersburg, and she was set up by friends on a blind date that night. She left for her blind date at about 9:30 p.m. Lisa Levy was 20 that night, and she had worked all day, but she had decided to go along with some of her fellow sisters to a disco, which I think is like a campus bar and like dancing spot. I guess when I think disco, right? Dancing spot. So I'm going to guess that. It was called Charades, and it was actually right next door to the Chi Omega House. So the girls left at 10 o'clock to go and do this. Karen Chandler had gone to her parents' house that night and cooked dinner for them. She was home before 11 that night and asleep, and her roommate Kathy Kleiner had gone to a wedding that day with her fiance, and then her fiance and a couple friends went out for dinner, and she too was home by about 11 that night, before midnight is what they said. So anytime between 11 and probably quarter to midnight, both she and Karen were in bed and sleeping. So Lisa only stayed at Charades for about half an hour, guys. And then she felt that she was too tired, and she went home to the Chi Omega House. Of course, it's right next door. So she was home before midnight as well and in bed sleeping. A strange incident did occur with some of the Chi Omega girls, one in particular, that night at Sharon's. She said that a tall, slender man with brown hair had been watching her that night, and that he kept staring at her, and she just felt really weirded out by that because she said, quote, "There was something about the way his eyes bore into me that made my skin crawl," end quote. So there was just something about this guy that was off-putting. He did come over and ask her to dance, and she kind of felt foolish because he seemed like an all right guy. It was just his eyes that were bothering her. So she did elect to go and dance with him. She told a friend that was sitting with her, quote, "I think I'm about to dance with an ex-con," end quote. Little did she know who she was actually dancing with at that point in time. Not just an ex-con, but a wanted man. He wasn't an ex-con at this point in time. He's a con, and he's a wanted man. She literally trembled the whole time they danced together. She was that creeped out by him. She just sensed it. And there were other people, of course, that sensed it. And there will be people in the future that just sensed this weirdness about Ted. And we've talked before about people saying they felt his eyes boring into them. So Some of the sisters returned from Sharon's at closing time, 2 p.m., to the Chi Omega house, and they noticed that the back door was unlocked. This was not a big deal to them because for the past couple days, for the past few days, the backdoor lock hadn't been working. Now this, I didn't really put two and two together until probably yesterday or the day before when I was looking over my notes again. I'm like, hey, wait a minute. Ted's been in Tallahassee for a few days at this point in time. I'm wondering if he actually didn't go to the Chi Omega house and do something to the lock so that way he could easily get back inside. Now, they did have a way of kind of shutting it really tightly to make it look like it was locked, but it was not fully locked. So at this point in time, nobody's suspicious. It's just the way things had been for a little while, but they did make sure that the door was tightly closed. It was 2:35 a.m. Margaret Bowman, like I said, had come back around 11, before midnight. She hadn't gone to sleep. The other girls had. She had stayed up talking to some of the other sisters. And one of the sisters she had been talking to finally left at 2:35 a.m. Margaret got ready to go to bed, and she was out as well, sleeping. Nita Neary, yet another sister. There's a lot of sisters, guys. So some of them I'll refer to as just another sister. Some of them are key to the story, so I say their names. Nita, like I said, Nita Neary was another sister. She got home at about 3 o'clock a.m. that day, or that morning, I should say, that early morning. This would be the early morning of January 15th. She had gotten home at 3 a.m. and she had taken the back route, of course. And she noticed that the back door was actually open. It was no longer shut tightly. It was now open at 3 a.m. So this is within an hour that they noticed this. She entered the house and she could hear footsteps above her, which was kind of weird because the lights were on and everything, but the house was quiet. She could hear footsteps above her, and then all of a sudden the footsteps turned into running footsteps. When she looked up, she saw a man who was wearing what she called like a dark blue ski hat. So probably one of those knitted caps that was pulled down. I actually have a quote, pulled down over the top half of his face, end quote. He was also wearing a dark colored jacket, and he was tall. He was holding either a log or a club in his right hand, and it appeared like there was some type of material wrapped around the base of it. But he was opening the door and out the door within seconds. So Nita, at this point in time, first she thought that the man was Ronnie and that he was just there fixing something or doing something in the house. But when she thought about it a little more, she figured out that the man was taller than Ronnie. He was kind of like a slight guy. This man was taller than him and just did not look like Ronnie in the few seconds that it took for her to think about it. So she figured at this point in time that the house had been robbed by this guy. She and another sister named Nancy Dowdy decided they were going to go check things out and see what had been taken by this man. So when they got upstairs, they noticed that Karen Chandler had come out of her room. She was staggering around with her hands to her head, and there was blood gushing everywhere. She was also talking a lot of nonsense. Karen shared a room with Kathy Kleiner, and when they went into the room, they noticed that Kathy was also sitting up in bed with her hands on her head. Sorry, guys. I'm talking really fast, so I'm making mistakes. Sorry, guys. So she had her hands on her head. Her head was also gushing blood, and she was talking nonsensically as well. Nancy then woke up the house mother because these two women had been attacked, and they immediately called 911. Now, 911... probably due to the chaos and the fact that Nancy was so shocked. It was Nancy that called 911. They thought that they heard that two girls were fighting over a boyfriend at the Chi Omega house. So they went over that way. They were not suspecting at all what the girls had just seen or what was to later come. So they went over, and police got there at about 3:23 a.m. So Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler were still alive at this point, but they were pretty horribly damaged, as you guys can probably understand. They were. Kathy had lots of cuts. She also had puncture wounds to the face. She had a broken jaw, broken teeth, and numerous skull fractures as well. She had several skull fractures as well. Of course, they didn't know they were fractures until later on, so they called them probable skull fractures, and this was why she was talking nonsensically. She had no idea what had happened to her because both she and Karen had been asleep before they'd been attacked. So it was kind of like Karen Sparks, right? While they were asleep, he would hit them really hard in the head so they became unconscious. They had no idea he was in the room, and they had no idea that he had hit them in the head because they were already asleep, guys. They didn't wake up. They had no defensive wounds, nothing like that, because he rendered them unconscious as soon as he got into the room, basically. Karen also had a broken jaw. She also had broken teeth, and she also had numerous skull fractures as well. Now, when police went into the room, it was a bloodbath, a literal bloodbath, guys. 2 girls had been attacked in their beds in this dorm room. So there was cast off everywhere. He had hit them numerous times. He had to have, guys. But they did find little bits of bark on their pillow and also on the bed sheets. So that's when they knew that the club or log that Nita had seen the stranger with was actually a piece of oak. It was an oak log, guys. So Lisa Levy's room was checked because she hadn't come out in all the chaos. And they found her in her bed, completely unresponsive. They were able to kind of get her breathing, guys, by using chest compressions and things of that nature. But by the time she arrived at the hospital, she was pronounced dead on arrival. She was 100% dead at this point in time. It appeared she'd been strangled. She had an injury to her right shoulder, and her right nipple had been almost completely bitten off. That's what he did to her. Her underwear were also on the floor beside her, and she had been sexually assaulted to some degree. Margaret Bowman's room was then checked. She lay on her face with the covers, oddly enough, pulled up to her neck. He'd tucked her back in. Alan Legier, if you guys remember, Alan Legier did this with some of his victims too. For some reason, he would tuck them back in. She lay, like I said, she lay on her face with the covers pulled up to her neck. Her skull had been horribly fractured to the point where you could actually see her brain through the fractures. Nylons were wrapped around her neck so tightly that it had actually doubled in size. And it had, she was dead as well. And there were bits of bark covering everywhere as well. So this weapon that Ted used was not one that he had brought with him at this point in time to this campus or to the Chi Omega house. This was a weapon of opportunity. I still think he must have tampered with the door somehow, knowing that he'd come back. But there were oak logs in the backyard. I'm going to guess they had stacked them for fires and stuff like that. And he took one of those. Now, he probably would have seen that if he had been in their backyard before. So it is a weapon of opportunity, but he may have been planning to use it from before. And that's only if he actually broke their lock. It's just a supposition on my account. So Ted knew that the girls at the Chi Omega house would be his type. He knew it. He'd probably been watching them. We know that he likes to do things of that nature. He probably had for a couple days been watching them. And he knew that these girls would be his type of girl. They would have the long hair. It would be parted in the middle. It would be worn down. They'd be slender. They'd be medium height. They would be beautiful. All things that Ted Bundy loved. He didn't necessarily care who he killed at this house. He didn't necessarily just pinpoint one victim. Although police believe that Margaret Bowman was probably his initial target. And though she hadn't been sexually assaulted, her panties had been ripped from her with such force that it actually left burn marks on her thighs. They assume she was his initial target. People figured that the intruder had either entered the house and waited, or that he had snuck in sometime between 2 and 3 when the door was tightly closed at 2 and then it was open at 3. That's probably the more likely scenario, guys. I don't think he actually snuck in and waited. I think it was more that he came in at that point in time. We know that Ted Bundy's nocturnal, and we know that he tends to, I mean, he did in Washington and Utah, he would attack earlier in the evening when it was dark. But I think at this point in time, he was figuring he'd wait until the early morning hours. Because if you remember, they caught him in Utah at 2:30 in the morning. So I'm just saying. They figured that Margaret was attacked first, and then Lisa. That's why they were dead. He was using his energy on them. And then Karen and Kathy, he had probably run out of some type of steam at that point in time. And he probably had heard that Nita, he may have heard that Nita had come home at that point, so he couldn't finish things off. But that's how they figured the sequence of events went. It was almost like Karen and Kathy were like an afterthought. And to tell you the truth, guys, this was done within a 15-minute span, from the time 2:35 until 3 o'clock. So we're looking at, I shouldn't say 15 minutes. We're looking at about a 25-minute span, guys. He had attacked 4 girls and beat them severely, 2 to death within 25 minutes. He was killing, and he was killing fast at this point in time. It was like the urges were too much, and he just had to get out as much destruction as he possibly could. But we're not done yet, guys. We're not done yet. So officers collected, of course, the oak bark, and they also collected more oak bark near the back door, which is probably how he had come in. That's probably why it was left there. They also found packaging from a pair of Hanes nylons in Margaret Bowman's wastebasket. So he'd actually brought the nylons with him to strangle them with. It was a new package. And of course, they knew that Margaret hadn't used them earlier that night. So he brought them with them. They of course noted that no one had fought their attacker right, because he'd attacked them when they were sleeping. No one saw the man after he disappeared, though. No one saw him after that. So 431 Dunwoody Street was about 8 blocks from the Chi Omega house. Cheryl Thomas lived in the house. There were also 2 other girls that lived in the house. This house had actually been broken up into at least 2 separate apartments. We're only going to be talking about 2 apartments, so I don't know if there were more in the house, but at least 2. So Cheryl Thomas lived in one apartment, and 2 of her good friends actually lived in the other one. These are people that she hung out with all the time. They usually made plans on Saturday nights together. So it's almost like the 3 of them were sharing a house, but they each had, I should say 2 of them were sharing one part of it, and then Cheryl had the other, but they would come together and do things together as well. So they actually had gone out dancing that night at a place called Big Daddy's. I don't know. It was just called Big Daddy's, guys. I'm sorry. And she had gone there with a date as well. She drove her date home at about 1 a.m. And she stayed there for a little while, you know, talking and doing whatever until about 2 a.m. And then the girls in the other apartment got home shortly after 2 a.m. Cheryl was tall with long dark hair parted in the middle that she wore down. And she was actually a ballerina, guys. So she was fairly slender, fairly muscular. She got ready for bed and she fell asleep really fast. It was around 3 a.m. Now, one of the girls in the second apartment woke up with a start at 4 a.m. She could hear a hammering sound somewhere in the house. She heard it again and again, and according to her, it was hard enough to make the house shake, or at least it felt like it was making the house shake to her. She woke up the other girl, and they heard the sounds again for about 10 seconds, and then it stopped. Until they heard, quote, moaning and whimpering, end quote, coming from Cheryl's apartment. So one of the girls actually called her boyfriend to ask what she should do. I think she was in so much shock, guys. I don't know if you've ever been in scenes of trauma or been confronted with an instance where you have to call 911, whether it be a fire or somebody has a heart attack or somebody has a stroke, for a couple minutes, you're actually paralyzed by fear. And you're like, oh my God, what do I do here? What do I do here? This happened to me once before. I was babysitting some kids and the house next door caught on fire. And legitimately, guys, I'm like, oh my God, what do I do? What do I do? And then I was like, call 911. And I'm not going to lie, my mind for a second was like, what's the number for 911? And then I could actually hear myself saying, you idiot, it's 911. So there are a couple seconds there where you're not sure what to do. And she was scared. So she called her boyfriend. And of course, her boyfriend told her to hang up and immediately call 911, which she did. They also called Cheryl's apartment as well, and they knew she was home, but of course they got no answer. So then they called 911. So it was boyfriend, Cheryl's apartment, 911. Sorry about that, guys. When police were finally able to open Cheryl's door, because it was locked from the inside, guys, her roommates actually helped them out because they knew where the hidden key was to get into the house, of course, because they're such good friends. They would know that information. Cheryl was still alive, thankfully. She had the worst skull fractures, guys. Her skull was actually fractured in 5 spots, whereas most of the other girls, it was 3 spots. I know that Margaret Bowman's skull was fractured to the extent that you could actually see her brain, but I think it was 3 distinct fractures. Don't quote me on that, though, guys. I know that they did say that Cheryl Thomas had the most fractures of the evening. Sorry. There was blood everywhere. And of course, like I said, she too had been severely beaten in the head, and she was wearing only her panties at that point in time. So while collecting evidence, police did find, oh God, a pantyhose mask. Again with the pantyhose masks. They creep me out so much. So it was very similar to the one Ted had been arrested with in Utah. Oh God, it still creeps me out. The, waistline pulled down with the eyes cut into it. At this point in time, he had actually cut one of the legs for some reason, but he'd still tied them up on top of it. And there were actually 2 brown hairs found within this masks as well. And it was found tangled up in the bed sheets, as far as I know. Now, since the front door still had the chain on it, remember they had trouble getting in, etc., etc., they figured that this perpetrator had come in through the window. No bark was found in Cheryl's apartment, so it would appear that after Ted left the Chi Omega house, he dropped the logs somewhere and then attacked Cheryl with something else. Maybe it was something he had with him at that point in time. I really don't know. But it also appeared that he took whatever this item was back with him at this point in time. So he'd gotten rid of the log, but he had kept whatever item this was that he had actually beat Cheryl with. Sorry, guys, just give me 1 second. So Karen, Kathy, and Chandler were the lucky ones. I'm sorry, guys. Karen, Kathy, and Cheryl were the lucky ones. They actually survived the attack. Margaret and Lisa, of course, are dead at this point in time. So 5 girls were attacked in a very short time frame in the early morning hours of January 15th of 1978. 5 girls in a frenzied attack. It's almost unbelievable, but it is true. Ted actually did do this. He couldn't stop himself. Now, of course, like I said before, not one of the survivors could remember what happened. Police surmised, of course, that while they were sleeping in bed, he hit them with a heavy log club so hard that they were knocked unconscious, and then he did the rest of the destruction to their bodies. There were also no useful prints found in any of the scenes. So the medical examiner doing the autopsy the next day also found that Lisa Levy, not only had he bitten her right nipple almost completely off, Ted had actually bitten her buttocks at least twice. There were at least 2 distinct bite marks within her flesh on her buttocks. The attacker had left 4 distinct teeth marks. That's how they knew he bit twice in her flesh. Now, the marks were removed and then preserved because everybody figured these would be invaluable to the case. We're going to get into that in a little bit. However, they preserved them the wrong way, so they deteriorated. But they had the foresight to take scale pictures of the bite marks. So the scale pictures, which showed all the detail, they showed everything, they were very well done, and they were to scale, would prove invaluable to the case later on. Lisa had been sexually assaulted both vaginally and anally. Not by a penis, guys, but by a bottle of Clairol hair mist. He had assaulted her with that as well. The medical examiner figured the two dead girls had been knocked unconscious, just like the police had thought, like we already stated. They did find out, though, that Margaret had not been sexually attacked in this. I don't know why Lisa was. I don't know if he just ran out of steam. I don't know if at this point in time the attacks were not just motivated by him wanting to rape them as well. The attacks were motivated by the fact that he wanted them dead. He just wanted to take this out on them. So Ted had, at this point in time, talked to some of his neighbors rather in a cursory nature. So just like the regular, hey, how are you? Oh, my name's Chris. I'm new to the area. They figured that he was a student at Florida State University, but they weren't sure. He kind of made it seem that way. He said that he had actually transferred from Stanford University and was now doing law at Florida State U. They were able to get that out of him. He said he knew the law well, that he was smarter than the police. Yeah, he's boasting at this point in time. And, quote, I can get out of anything because I know my way around, end quote. He had told them this. Now, after finding out about what had happened on the campus in Cheryl's apartment, after this had come on the news, he and some of his neighbors did talk about it. There must have been like a common TV room or something like that, guys, where they were able to see it on the news together. And Ted and Chris Hagen, I should say, said, quote, this was a professional job. The man has done it before. He's probably long gone by now, end quote. And of course, Ted would know he wasn't long gone by now, but yes, he had done this before. So the only semen that they were able to find at the scene, there was actually nothing within Lisa Levy because he had penetrated her with a different object, was on Cheryl's bed. They did do testing on it, and they were able to find out that the person that had left the semen was a non-secretor. We know that Ted is a secretor, and his blood type was O. I don't think that the semen that they found there, they couldn't distinguish what it was, right? Because he's not secreting his blood type in it. So they know that Ted is a secretor. This would come up as a question in the trial. It's almost like him trying to say, oh no, it couldn't have been me because look, somebody left semen and it doesn't belong to me. However, they weren't sure how long ago it had been that Cheryl had washed her sheets, and she had a boyfriend. She had dates. I shouldn't say she had a boyfriend. She had dates. She met people. So it's not entirely improbable that she hadn't earlier in the week invited a date back and just not changed her sheets after. So the semen evidence wasn't really useful, let's just say. And of course, police did at that point in time have the two hairs from the mask that they found in Cheryl's bedding as well. And the bite marks from Lisa Levy. That's all the evidence they had. Oh, and the little oak pieces at this point in time for this case. No usable prints, no other DNA, nothing like that. Now, Anne's mom actually sent her clippings from the Florida murders and asked Anne, do you think this could be Ted? And Anne wanted to say no, guys. She was like, no, why? He's on the run. Why would he go and do that? Like, just literally, it did not come into her mind at that point that Ted was in Florida, but he was. These attacks were, she said that she also didn't think that it was Ted because remember before his attacks had been so organized, guys. Sorry, my nose is really itchy today, guys. And she said she didn't believe the attacks could be related to Ted because, quote, they were the work of an almost clumsy rampaging killer, end quote. So at that point in time, like I said, Ted had become completely disorganized in his secret life as well. He was organized enough to know not to leave evidence, but his style had become more frenzied. He didn't have the time to spend with the bodies like he had in Colorado, in Utah, and in Washington. He just didn't have that time. He was now almost like he was attacking as according to need and his urges. So instead of being as organized as he was before, even though he wasn't leaving lots of evidence around, he still actually did, right? He left the mask, he left the hairs, which he wouldn't have known about, things of that nature, but nothing really concrete at this point in time that connected him to those crimes. He was attacking and killing at an alarming rate though, guys, like more alarming than before, like 5 in one night. It's almost astronomical that he did this 5 in one night and so close together as well. 4 in the same building, but he did do it. He was less, I guess the best thing to say is he's less methodical in his attacks. Yes, he may have been stalking the Chi Omega girls, but he didn't actually specifically target only one girl that night. They feel that the initial target was Margaret, but he also attacked 3 other girls as well. So it complicated things a little bit more at this point in time. And of course, he couldn't hide the bodies. They would all show what he had done. They would have been found quicker than his other victims because he had only done it 1, 2 at the most at a time. He couldn't hide the bodies so that decomposition would make it harder for people to find out what he had done either. He just didn't have the time to do this at that point in time. They were the most... God, I'm sorry, I have to say it again, guys. They were the most fresh bodies that the police had to work with in the case of Ted. So on January 13th, this was actually a day before, a day and a half before the attacks had taken place. A man called up the police and reported that his license tags, which I'm assuming are license plates, let me know if I'm wrong about that. I talked about this with my partner for a little bit, and he said that tags and plates were probably the same thing. So it appeared that his license plates had been stolen from his car. The number on the plates was 13-D-11300. So he reported them missing. This man, though, lived very close to Cheryl's apartment, the Chi Omega house, and also Ted's apartment at the Oak as well. So on February 5th, another man reported his white Dodge van had been stolen. This was actually from the Florida State University parking lot. And it had, of course, Florida plates on it. And there was also like a sticker. I shouldn't call it a sticker. There was also a university number written on the van because it was actually, he worked for the audiovisual department. So he actually worked at the university. So he had this number on there so he could park on campus. His whole entire van was stolen. And this man, like I said, had worked for the university. So now we have stolen plates and we have a stolen white Dodge van. On Wednesday, February 8th, 1978, 14-year-old Leslie Parmenter, who was actually the daughter of the Jacksonville, this is Jacksonville, Florida, chief of detectives. So kind of like Melissa Smith, left school. She was going to be picked up by either her father or her brother. She wasn't sure which one, but she knew one of them was coming to get her. And she actually went to the Kmart parking lot that was close by to wait for them. Suddenly, a white van stopped in front of her. it was essentially blocking her path at this point in time, guys. And a man with dark wavy hair, so Ted's hair starting to grow out a little bit, eyeglasses, which is new. I haven't heard about him wearing the eyeglasses before. Plaid pants and and a dark colored jacket came toward her. Okay. He was wearing a badge, which she described later as like a plastic looking badge, that said Richard Burton and firefighter on it. Richard Burton, guys. So husband of Liz Taylor. But anyway, he's now calling himself Richard Burton. And he asked her a bunch of questions, like where she had been and what she was doing in the Kmart parking lot and what she was supposed to be doing, things of that nature. She said he seemed very nervous and afraid. And she was a pretty smart 14-year-old girl. Her dad had taught her very well, and she said he was just too unkempt for her to believe that he was a firefighter. He was just way too disheveled. It just didn't make sense that he was a firefighter. And this added to the, of course, she added to his nervous nature, like how he seemed to be nervous and fearful around her. Not fearful of her, afraid of what was going on. So it didn't make sense to her that this guy was a firefighter. She said, quote, he had a strange look in his eye, a stare that made me shiver, end quote. So we've heard this before, right? With the girls from Chi Omega at the bar. He had, like I said, essentially blocked her path, so she couldn't actually get out of the way of the van. But luckily at that point in time, her brother Danny pulled up to come and get her. And he was super suspicious of the man. He was like, hey, what are you doing? What do you want with my sister? Like, what are you doing here? Both of them knew about stranger danger because her dad was chief of detectives, and this guy was just not up to snuff. Danny was very suspicious, and he wanted to try to talk to this guy. But of course, Danny told Leslie to get in the truck, and as he approached the van took off. So Danny and Leslie tried to follow the van, and they were able to note the license plate, which was 13-D-11300. They did, however, lose the van in traffic. Ted was able to get away, but they did have the license plate number. And because their dad was chief of detectives, they immediately went to him and told him the story. Now, their dad wanted to check it out that day, but he was very, very busy at that point in time, so he wouldn't be able to get to it until the next day. He wouldn't be able to call in this tip until the next day. And it would actually cost another girl her life. Kimberly Diane Leach was 12 years old, guys. 12. So like Lynette Culver, some people do put Lynette at 13, but a lot of the other sources I've read has said she was 12. We know Kim was 100% 12 years old that day. She came from Lake City, Florida, which is halfway between Jacksonville and Tallahassee. About halfway, give or take. She was 5 foot in height and weighed about 100 pounds. She had long dark hair that she wore down and parted in the middle. And on February 9th, Kim went to school just like every other day. She had gone into homeroom, she did all that, and then she went to her next class, which was phys ed. While she was in her phys ed class, she noticed that she had forgotten to grab her purse from her homeroom classroom. So she asked permission from the teacher to go and get it in the homeroom, and the teacher said yes. She actually had a friend that came along with her because the friend had also forgotten something and needed to get it. So they walked into the building together, and Kim got her purse. The friend went and got whatever item she needed and then was running back to catch up with Kim, who was already on her way back to phys ed. She said that she saw Kim get into a, quote, white car. However, due to the chaos of that day and due to what she had probably seen, she was unable to clearly recall the vehicle, but she was able to clearly recall the man that was driving the vehicle, to such an extent, guys, that when they put her under hypnosis in the hopes of getting a description of the man, of getting a better description of the man, she started reliving it. She was fighting him. She became terrorized. It was horrible. She actually relived it to that extent. So yes, she definitely remembered the man, but she was confused about the vehicle. A school crossing guard had also noticed a man in a white van blocking traffic. This van was blocking traffic, just staring at the school children in the schoolyard. Another man was also annoyed by the white van that was blocking traffic at that point in time. He wanted to get around and do what he had to do. So he looked to his left and saw a teenager with long dark hair being led by a, quote, angry man. He called him an angry man with dark wavy hair who appeared to be in his early 30s. This man actually figured that this was a father and a daughter, and that the daughter must have been doing something wrong, so the father was angrily taking her home. That's what this man thought. A woman driver also saw, it was actually a woman and her maid, also saw a man, she could see the driver, of a white van. This was a little bit down the road. He'd finally stopped blocking traffic. And it was driving erratically. The van was driving erratically. Nearly hit she and the maid because he was driving so erratically. And she saw the man and said he seemed, quote, angry and enraged, end quote. Now, he wasn't looking at the road and she couldn't see a passenger from her viewpoint. But he seemed to be yelling down into the seat next to him. He wasn't looking at the road, remember? That's why he's driving so erratically at that, and he's enraged. And the vehicle almost hit them, but it took off, of course, and she lost it at that point in time. I do also want to point out that Liz's daughter, Molly, remember Liz, and Molly, who Ted had been a father figure for, was actually 12 at this point in time, the same age as Kimberly Leach. And he'd gotten mad at Liz once because he had wanted to take Molly, and I believe it was a couple of her friends, out to do something, and Liz had said no, and he was angry because he's like, what, you don't trust me with Molly? I wonder why. It was just a like a sense that Liz had at that point in time, because remember, she was continuously questioning Ted at that point in time, but she knew enough. Something told her not to let the two of them be alone anymore at that point. So Detective Parmenter, remember this would be Leslie and Danny's father, was able to call in the tip about the Richard Burton firefighter the next day. And he learned that the license plate was stolen, of course. So an APB was put out to be on the lookout for this stolen license plate. Leslie and Danny were also able to give a very, very good description of the man. It was such a good description that they were able to put out 2 composites, and because they each did one, and they were strikingly similar to each other. And both also later picked Ted's picture out of a photographic lineup. This is later, though. An officer did stop Ted later on. This was after he did what he did with Kim Leach. And he was like, he noticed that Ted was skulking around a Toyota at that point in time. And of course, he was suspicious. Things just didn't look right. And he noted that a plate that the man had, I'm not sure, I can't quite remember how he was able to see the tags, but he noted that the tag was 13-D-11300, the stolen plate. And he questioned Ted about it. I think he was able to see it in some papers that Ted had, because Ted had tried to say that the Toyota was his, and he just locked himself out or something along those lines. And he pointed out, oh, I know what he said. He said that he was just going to the Toyota to get his books, because there were some books that were in the front of the Toyota. He wasn't going to, obviously. He was going to steal it. But he had papers with him, and they were able to see the plate that way. So the officer asked to look at the plate. Ted showed it to him, found out that, of course, the officer didn't know it at that point in time, but the plates were stolen. And Ted said that he'd found this plate somewhere. And when the officer wanted to question him further, he actually took off and ran away. He ran so fast, of course, that the officer couldn't catch him, and he disappeared. But he was questioned by a police officer at this point in time. Not about the murders or anything like that, just about this plate. So Ted decided, of course, at this point in time, that he has to get out of the Oak. So he It's just the heat is on too much for him at this point. He's got to get out. He may have felt, more than likely, he felt that people were on to him, that he was kind of overstaying his welcome there. But it also could have been the fact that he didn't have the money to pay his rent and he knew that rent was coming. So it was either leave or be kicked out, probably. He had abandoned the white van at this point in time. He did completely wipe the van clean of fingerprints, but he didn't do anything else to it. And there were mountains of evidence in there, guys. This was, when I say this van was filthy, this van was filthy. There was dust all over it. There were debris all over it. Underneath of it too, there was a whole bunch of debris. But there were absolutely no prints whatsoever in this vehicle. Ted actually also wiped his room. None of Ted's prints, I should say, were in this vehicle. Prints from the original owner were in it, but none of Ted's. So he only wiped down where he was and what he had touched. He had the foresight to do that. The van was actually found on February 13th, and it was taken in, of course, for processing. Now, Ted had also left his apartment at the Oak print-free as well. As a convicted offender, his prints would have been on file, and he really didn't want police to know that he was in Florida at that point. So, of course, like I said, the van was filthy when they brought it in for processing. There was dust, debris, and there were actual blood stains in it from a type B blood type, which was Kim's blood type. Footprints were also found inside of it. In like the dirt and debris. That's how dirty it was. There were footprints, and there were also drag marks in it. Police could see drag marks within the van. They also found tons of fibers in there as well, which would be helpful in the trial, helping to connect Ted and Kim Leach. Fiber evidence was used for that. And they also found some price tags from a sporting goods store inside as well. These fibers that they were able to find were a match to fibers left on Kim from Ted's jacket. So fibers from Ted's jacket were actually in there, and fibers from Ted's jacket were actually on Kim's body. But there were also fibers from the carpeting in the van on Kim's body as well. So Ted stole yet another car. And you know he likes his Volkswagen Beetles, so this was actually an orange Volkswagen Beetle that he stole. He had originally taken another Volkswagen Beetle, or was going to take another Volkswagen Beetle, until he saw that the odometer had a lot of kilometers on it and that it was immaculately clean, but it was a really old car. He figured that the car belonged to some kid, so he abandoned that car like a block away or whatever, because he couldn't steal from someone who didn't have a lot of money. He had no qualms about killing or about stealing from other people, but if the person that he stole from seemed to be poor, he wouldn't steal from them. So an officer, and he actually stole another set of tags as well, and an officer spotted the orange VW in Pensacola, Florida, and this was early in the morning on February 15th. He got curious about it, much like the police officer in Utah, and phoned in the car's ID and found out that the car was stolen. So, of course, he threw on the lights, and there was a short chase. It only lasted for about a mile before the car pulled over. And, of course, at this point in time, one of FBI's 10 most wanted escaped killer, escaped kidnapper for sure. Ted Bundy had finally been caught. They didn't know it was Ted Bundy at this point in time, though. I want to point that out. Now, he actually fought the officer, guys. He was not going to go down easy. He tried to run away, and of course the officer said, stop, or I'll shoot. But they ended up getting into a fight where they were like basically wrestling each other around. And Ted was hitting the officer was hitting Ted. A neighbor came out and was like, hey, stop, what's going on? The officer thought the neighbor was going to help him, but the neighbor actually thought that the officer was attacking Ted. Regardless, he finally said, look, I'm a police officer. I have to get the suspect down. And Ted was taken into custody at that point in time. He'd been on the run for about 47 days by this point, guys. And he had killed 3 women and left 3 others with various states of brain damage as well. So while Ted was in the back of the cruiser, he actually said that he wished the officer had killed him over and over again. He said it over and over again. So he was taken in, and they asked what his name was, and he claimed to be Kenneth Meisner. Kenneth Raymond Meisner, actually. He had a middle name as well. The guy, Ted did have ID on him from Kenneth Meisner. They were able to find the real Kenneth Meisner, who of course was not even in Pensacola, Florida at that point in time. He was living his best life somewhere else, and he was shocked to learn that somebody had actually stolen his ID. When he was arrested, Ted actually had 3 sets of ID on him, probably for Chris Hagen, probably as well as Kenneth Meisner, but also for someone else as well. And 21 stolen credit cards were on him. So at that point in time, of course, he's arrested for evading an officer. He's probably arrested for assaulting an officer, and he was arrested for, I think it was 36 counts of fraud. Just at that point in time, they still don't know who he was. They kept asking him who he actually was because, of course, they had found the real Kenneth Meisner, and he said, quote, "Who, me? Kenneth R. Meisner, John R. Doe." End quote. By later on the night of the 16th, though, yeah, it took them more than a day, they were finally able to find out who they had, and it was, of course, Theodore Robert Bundy, one of the 10 most wanted men in the United States. The police were able to find out that it was him. At this point in time, Ted called both Anne and Liz. He actually wanted Anne to come to Florida and be with him at this point in time because he was scared and he needed her. Remember, I said she was like a mother type figure to Ted. He needed her support. But in the end, Anne was going to go, but in the end, she was actually blocked from going by detectives. She wasn't allowed to go. She was getting ready to go, but she wasn't allowed to go. So he called Liz only to talk. And he told her he had only told detectives who he was in order for him to be able to make these phone calls. So he copped to his actual persona. He copped to who he actually was in order to be able to make phone calls to his friends and family and let them know he had been rearrested. When he called Liz, this would be like a couple days later, he actually gave her a confession of sorts. He didn't tell her exactly what he had done, who he had hurt, things of that nature, but he alluded to what he had did. So he told her without actually telling her. She wrote down everything he said so as not to forget it later on. At this point in time, I do want to point out that Liz was dating another man. I actually think this other man was living with her at this point in time. So this was not a romantic thing that she felt for Ted. She still loved him, though. I don't know if she still loved him romantically or just as a friend at that point in time, but she still had feelings for him. He claimed that he'd been talking to a priest. So if you remember, when he was in Colorado, he had suddenly found the Mormon religion, but now he's talking to a Catholic priest at this point in time. And he said, quote, "I have a responsibility to those who have suffered, and I want to reconcile things," end quote. So he told her that he was going to make a confession of sorts. And Liz was pissed when she later figured out that he hadn't meant to do any of these things. Of course, Ted never meant to. Maybe at that point in time, he was thinking of it, but he never really meant to. The longer he had to think about things, the longer he had to develop a story. He also told her, quote, "I was afraid you would have nothing to do with me if I told you. And didn't you always think it was possible?" End quote. Meaning, didn't she always think it was possible that he was Ted? Yes, of course she did. But at the same point in time, she's now confronted with the knowledge full hand. He told her, quote, "There is something the matter with me. It wasn't you. It was me. I just couldn't contain it. I've fought it for a long, long time. It got too strong. It was taking more and more of my time," end quote. And he also confirmed that that's the reason why he did so terribly in law school, is because he didn't have time to study or sleep. He admitted that he'd tried to kill her. He did admit to the chimney incident where he'd put the towels underneath of her door and closed the damper to her chimney, trying to suffocate her. He admitted it to her. He also said that he did not have a split personality. He made sure that she knew that, and, quote, I remember everything I've done, and, quote, it wasn't like I had forgotten or couldn't remember, but it was just over, gone. The force wasn't pushing me any longer, end quote. So he meant that after he murdered those girls, after he murdered, he felt better, and he was able to go on with life until he felt the urges again. She told him that the police were saying that he had started killing sometime in 1969, or that he had told police he had started killing sometime in 1969. I believe at this point in time, he hadn't mentioned anything, just maybe little elusive facts. But he told her, quote, the police are years off, end quote. So when she told him that police thought he started killing in 1969, he did say that the police were years off about when he started killing. He was, like I said, initially charged with, 34 counts of forgery. And, of course, the auto theft. And, once again, he was going to represent himself. On April 7th, searchers were finally able to find the remains of Kim Leach. The dirt and debris from the van. God, I'm having problems today. I'm sorry, guys. The dirt and debris from the van helped them to isolate the spot where the van had been. So that's where they were looking for Kim at this point in time. And she was found in a small steel roofed shed that they use for pigs who are giving birth. I don't want to call it a piggery, a birthing place for pigs. That's actually where they found her body. She was naked except for her shoes and white turtleneck. Now, the rest of her clothes, oddly enough, were folded neatly beside her. That's another thing that Ted doesn't usually do, is leave clothes. Yes, in one of the cases from Colorado, I think it was Denise Oliverson's case, they found her bike and her shoes, but none of her other clothing. In this instance, they did find it. So that shows you just how disorganized Ted had become at this point. Now, due to the heat and the dry air, her body was actually mummified, guys. It was mummified. It wasn't necroted or desiccated in the ways that we would think it was. So there was still flesh on her. It wasn't enough flesh, but there was still flesh on her, so they could see some of the things that had happened to her. She appeared to have had, quote, a considerable amount of force applied to the neck that tore the skin, end quote. They couldn't tell full on if she had been strangled because of the mummification process. And unlike others, she had, of course, shown signs of being sexually abused in various ways. But her vagina didn't have enough tissue around it for them to be able to tell definitively. She was actually found in Suwannee State Park. I hope I'm saying it right. Suwannee State Park, which is about 56 kilometers away from Lake City, where she had been abducted from. And she appeared, of course, to have died elsewhere, because remember, the bloodstains were found in the van and there were drag marks in the van, and just left in the pig shed. He probably, of course, messed with her after she was dead too. So that's why the clothing was the way it was. So, Ted stood trial for the Chi Omega homicides in Miami around July 3rd. Some dates say that it was June 30th. Some articles said that, because I did actually check into some articles at this point in time. But Anne Rule's book said that it was July 3rd of 1978. July 3rd of 1979. So I'll say July 3rd. This was actually the first case to be televised nationally in the US. So yes, before you'd get, the Manson trial where we had footage of the girls going into the courtroom. Yes, before then you would have footage of people leaving the courtroom or entering the courtroom. But this was the first trial where they actually televised the trial nationally on the US, or in the US. So there you go. Ted, of course, led his own legal team again because, you know, he's a lawyer. He finally actually got to play the lawyer he wanted to play. And he didn't do too badly. He actually did argue well enough. He also, at this point in time, had collected his own fair share of groupies. Because he was so handsome and charming and humorous, the girls went wild for Ted. I don't know why, because of the crimes he was accused of, but of course, he had a number of groupies at this point in time. However, public opinion had turned against Ted at this point in time. They were no longer glad that he had escaped. They saw the full-on terror of Ted Bundy at this point in time. He originally was going to take a plea deal, for 75 years. But that would mean he would have to admit to his guilt. And he was thinking about doing it until the last minute. And then he said no, he wasn't going to take the deal because it would mean he'd have to admit that he was guilty. And at this point in time, he was saying, no, I'm not guilty. So no, I'm not going to do that. On April 27th, he was taken to a dentist of 1979. They actually surprised him with it. He didn't know he was going to the dentist because they didn't want to give him time to do something to his teeth, like try to file them down. And of course, he had dental impressions taken. He didn't like it, but he had them taken, and they did match the photographs of the scale photographs of the bite marks from Lisa Levy's buttocks. They matched it perfectly. This was actually also the first time that forensic odontology was used to convict somebody. It was the first time that forensic odontology was used to point to a killer, guys. They had never used it before this point in time. Teeth, like you guys know, as long as they haven't had braces on them, although dental work, of course, can show up, guys. So teeth are very distinctive. They are as distinctive as fingerprints. And this was something that they learned from this trial, that you could use bite marks to potentially show a suspect had killed somebody because our bite marks are so unique to us. Like you guys can tell I never had the braces, so I have very distinctive bite marks. People would be able to tell if I was a perpetrator or if I was a victim due to my dental work, I guess, due to my teeth. Now, Ted's teeth were really distinctive. He had like a gap between his first two teeth. I also want to say that one of his incisors was protruded a little bit slightly, and he also had chips on the incisor. So police were fairly certain, so experts were fairly certain these were his teeth marks. However, Ted did point out, hey, you don't have the actual piece of flesh from Lisa Levy. You just have these photographs, and how do I know you didn't mess with them and things of that nature. But it took a jury about 7 hours, a little bit less than 7 hours, to convict Ted Bundy of the Chi Omega murders and assaults at that point in time. And the judge, who was actually Judge Edward Cowart, sentenced him to death. He imposed the death penalty on Ted at this point in time. So maybe Colorado didn't want to, but Florida does like to use the death penalty, and Ted was sentenced to death for his parts in the Chi Omega murders. Judge Cowart called his acts, you guys know it, it's a movie title, quote, extremely wicked, shockingly evil, and vile, end quote. But he also said to Ted, quote, it's a tragedy for this court to see such a total waste of humanity that I've experienced in this courtroom. You're a bright young man. You'd have made a good lawyer, and I'd have loved to have you practice in front of you. And I'd have loved to have you practice in front of me. But you went another way, partner. Take care of yourself, end quote. So the judge said he meant it. He had no animosity towards Ted. He just thought it was such a shame that Ted decided to murder instead of using his skills as a lawyer. He actually thought that it was a waste of humanity. So on January 7th of 1980, Ted stood trial for Kim Leach's murder, and of course the death penalty was attached to that as well. This was in Orlando, Florida. Of course, they needed change of venue at this point in time. They used the fibers from the van and on Kim to connect Ted to Kim. as well. So fiber evidence was pretty important in this case. And they also used the eyewitness testimony from the various people that had seen the van that day as well. Now, once again, in less than 8 hours this time, of course, Ted was found guilty. Ted actually proposed to Carol Ann Boone during the sentencing phase of his trial. And she said yes. So due to an obscure Florida law, this is really, it's not funny, guys, but the law is a little funny, that says, quote, a marriage declaration in court in the presence of a judge constitutes a legal marriage, end quote. So this meant that the two of them were actually married and she became Mrs. Ted Bundy. She actually moved to Florida so that she could be closer to Ted during his trials and his incarcerations at this point in time. They are now full on married. Like I said before, Ted cannot live without having somebody fully in his corner. If it couldn't be Liz, Carol Ann Boone was just as good as anybody else. He was sentenced to death, of course, on February 9th of 1980. Oh, that was like a year after he killed Kim, or a year exactly to the date after he killed Kim. And he was sent to Rayford Prison, aka Florida State Prison in Stark, Florida. In October of 1982, Carol gave birth to a baby girl. Her name is Rose, and she says that Ted Bundy is the father. He's on the birth certificate. This is despite the fact that in Rayford Prison, there are no conjugal visits. However, people did note that if you were able to bribe the guards in some way, they'd look the other way so that you could do what you needed to do. So he apparently managed to get one in at some point in time, and Carol Ann had a baby in October of 1982. The end of October kind of creeps me out because I'm born at the end of October. Creepy. So all throughout the years on death row, of course, Ted filed numerous appeals, including one that said that he had ineffective legal counsel, which is kind of funny because he was his own legal counsel. He had a team as well behind him, but he was the main lawyer, so that's why it's a little bit funny. Of course, he wanted to drag everything out through the system for as long as he possibly could because he did not want to die. He was actually afraid of dying. And his death warrant was signed at least three times, but he always managed to avoid it at the final minute. Somebody always called down and gave him a little bit longer, particularly in 1986, in order for his appeals process to go through in his various trials in Florida and things of that nature. At this point in time, I believe it was in early 1985, he actually became angry at Anne. He no longer wanted to talk to her about anything connected with the crimes. He did still send her a couple letters throughout the years, not very many. He no longer relied on her because she didn't believe he was innocent, guys. It had nothing to do with Anne. He already knew about the book deal, but he claimed that she'd used him. He knew about the book deal a long time ago, and he said he was okay with it. But now he claimed that she'd used him. He was basically just mad that she wouldn't say he was innocent in her book, and that he couldn't manipulate her into believing that he was innocent. He was very angry about this. He also tried to tell her that she owed some of her book money to Carol Ann Boone, that she should be supporting Carol Ann because that was Ted's wife and, of course, the daughter at this point in time. He actually said that. But he did talk to Anne a couple times after that. However, when he did, it was just to either prey on the fact that she felt guilty about not being able to support him. She still thought of him as that little brother figure. And he wanted to prey on her guilt, and also because she had done so well with the book, right? But he also wanted to let her know how stupid she was, because she only had police training and he was a criminal. She once wrote to him about, these are the various points that a psychopath would have, or the various points that a serial killer, I should say, would have. And he said that in his esteemed estimation, she was kind of being foolish. There were other things she should be looking at, like, yeah, he fully embraced the celebrity he had at this point in time. In 1984, they actually did find 2 hacksaws in Ted's cell, and that he had sawed through one of the iron bars in his window and then just like reattached it with homemade glue. So he had attempted to escape again in 1984. But at that point in time, he was just moved to another cell. Oh, we have a visitor, guys. It's Lola. I don't know if she's going to be savage today. Oh, hi, girl. So at this point in time, he did actually also talk to Liz once more. He wrote her a letter. I believe it was in 1980 that he wrote her the letter. And after that, they never talked again. It was just basically to say goodbye, the letter was. So when he was giving interviews or talking about his crimes, and he did a lot of that, guys, he very much... he became an infamous celebrity, and a lot of people wanted to talk to him. Thank you, Lola. Particularly because at this point in time, the behavioral BSU, the Behavioral Sciences Unit, had been developed at Quantico. John Douglas and Bob Resler, of course, they coined the term serial killer at this point in time. So they wanted to talk to a lot of the men that were known serial killers that were on death row at this point in time. People like, or in prison at this point in time, people like Edmund Kemper and people like Ted Bundy. So everybody wanted to talk to him at that point, just to see if they could figure him out. When he did give these various interviews to the media or to the other officers, he would talk about his crimes very elusively, very kind of in a roundabout way, but he would also talk about them in third person, because it almost made it easier for him to talk about his crimes that way without fully admitting his guilt, right? Without him admitting to being guilty, he was able to talk about what he did, and he derived pleasure from it. Trust me, guys, he did. It seems like he still cared about what people thought. Like, he still wanted people out there to believe he was innocent, particularly because his appeals were going on, right? He didn't want to give the courts more ammunition about him. But he also said he did this to, quote, avoid the stigma of confession, end quote. It was the easiest way for him to admit to his guilt. So he claimed in later interviews, this was later during confessions, which we're going to get into, at first that he killed his victims to, quote, eliminate the possibility of being caught, end quote, but it later became part of the, quote, adventure. And, quote, the ultimate possession was in fact the taking of the life, and then the physical possession of the remains after, end quote. He actually said this. In 1984, Ted contacted Bob Keppel, who was at that point in time hunting for the Green River Killer, right? He was looking for Gary Ridgway. Of course, it wouldn't be until 2001 that they were able to pinpoint it was Gary Ridgway, but he's looking for him. The Green River Killer was really active between the years of 82 and 84. 85. So of course they're actively looking for him at this point in time. And Ted said he could offer his expertise to Bob Keppel at this point in time. And I've actually, so he profiled the Green River Killer, Ted did. And I've heard that his profile was a closer match to Gary Ridgway than the FBI's was. I mean, if anybody should know, it would be Ted. It was Ted who actually called Gary Ridgway the Riverman. That's where they got the nickname from, the Riverman. Green River Killer is also known as the Riverman, and it actually came from Ted Bundy. The nickname actually came from Ted. And Keppel, Bob Keppel later wrote a book about it called, quote, The Riverman, Ted Bundy and I hope... God, I'm really having problems. I'm sorry, guys. The book is called The Riverman, Ted Bundy and I Hunt for the Green River Killer. He wrote a book about his experience working with Ted. Ted actually did like Bob Keppel. In fact, he liked a number of the officers that he met up with. He thought they were okay guys. Stupid. He thought they were very stupid, but he thought they were okay guys. And he really did like Bob Keppel for some reason. He's still, of course, at this point in time, amassing many, many women friends. He would write to them from prison, and of course he would make it seem like they were the only ones he was writing to from prison, but he was probably writing to hundreds of women at this point in time. Carol Ann Boone, sometime seemingly in 1986, became fully aware of Ted's guilt. She was finally able to see past this love she had for the man. I don't know if you guys have actually ever seen pictures of Carol Ann Boone. She's not necessarily what Ted would normally go for, I guess, in my estimation. So she probably felt very flattered that a man as good looking as Ted was paying attention to her. Finally, his appeals were exhausted. Guys, they finally went through the system. Now, most of the time, if you're on death row, you're on death row for 20 plus years, guys. The appeals process goes on for a long, long time. They wanted Ted dead, and they wanted him dead fast. He was just too much of a nuisance. He's tried to escape. He's escaped twice, but he's tried to escape 2 other times before then. So they know he's dangerous to have around. They're afraid that he could try to escape again or of what he might do. So they wanted the death warrant signed. They wanted him dead. And it finally came down that the 4th warrant was signed and his execution was to take place January 24th of 1989. He finally had a date. Now, in the weeks before the date, he started to confess. He started to actually tell people what he had done. He was confessing, but he wasn't. He was, but he wasn't. He was elusive once again about the confessions. Sometimes he did them. He didn't necessarily do them in the 3rd person at that point in time, but he was very elusive, and he would leave certain details out. He'd only give cursory things about them. He figured if he kept confessing to his various murders, remember, they're 30 plus. He figured if he could keep confessing, he could push off the date that way, number 1. And number 2, he figured if he only gave them bits and pieces, that they would want a full confession, so they'd stay his execution date again so that he could give a full confession. He also, tried to get his lawyers to go to the families of his victims to ask them to write on his behalf for clemency. He thought that the families of his victims would ask for clemency on his behalf so that he could, ostensibly, so that he could keep confessing and eventually get to their loved one and tell them where their loved one is, if the person was still missing, or what had actually happened to their loved one. Of course, none of the families that were contacted would agree to this. They said no. He did come out and say that the 5th leg bone that they found at the Naslin Ott site was all that was left of George Ann Hawkins. I still don't know why that's never been checked out, guys. As far as I know, it hasn't been. He also said that Donna Manson's body was up in Taylor Mountain. I don't know why they didn't find the rest of her body with the skulls, but he said that he'd taken her skull to Liz's place and burned the skull in the fireplace. But he did say he left her body up on Taylor Mountain. He admitted to murdering in 7 states, 7, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Colorado, Utah, Florida, and an unknown hitchhiker in California. He admitted to that. He said he killed all 8 of the victims in Washington and 3 that were unidentified and the police didn't know about. He said he killed 2 people in Oregon. If you guys remember, Kathy Parks was found in Washington, so that's why they didn't lump her in with the Oregon ones. He said he had left more bodies, unknown bodies, in Colorado. He admitted to all the victims in Utah. he admitted to killing Lynette Culver in Idaho, and of course the unknown hitchhiker in California. But who can say for sure how many states he actually murdered in? He was in Michigan for a while. Did he kill there? It's possible he was in Georgia. Did he kill there? And who's to say any of the other various places he may have gone? I mean, he liked to drive, guys. So who's to say for sure? Ted confessed in some detail to killing in Washington, guys. Linda Ann Healy, Donna Gail Manson, Susan Elaine Rancourt, Roberta Kathleen Parks. I know she was taken from Oregon, but she was found in Washington, so he included her in there. Brenda Carol Ball, George Ann Hawkins, Janice Ann Ott, Denise Marie Naslund, and the 3 other unidentified ones. They figured he either didn't identify them because he wanted to keep those bits and pieces to himself, or that he never found out their names. And also remember, he said that some of his victims were, quote, too young, too close to family, and too close to home, end quote. And so he'd never talk about those victims. They could have been some of the unidentified ones. In Utah, he admitted to killing Nancy Wilcox, Melissa Ann Smith, Susan Curtis, Laura Ann Amy, and Deborah Jean Kent. Now, this is a piece of information I didn't know about. It was not in the books, of course, because of the times that they were printed. I found it later on a website in articles. So I did verify it. One piece of Deborah Jean Kent was found, and it wasn't a place that Ted said it would be. It was her kneecap, her patella bone. They were able to find it. And in 2015, they did DNA test it, and it was proven to be Deborah Jean Kent's. So I apologize for saying she was missing for all those years. They were able to find one piece of her. So she has been a small piece of her, but it was given back to her family. Plus 3 unidentified people. In Colorado, he admitted to killing Karen Eileen Campbell, Julie Cunningham, and Denise Lynn Oliverson. In Idaho, he admitted to killing Lynette Dawn Culver. In California, this unidentified hitchhiker that he'd picked up and killed. In Oregon, he confessed to 2 unidentified girls. He never identified them. In Florida, he admitted to killing Margaret Elizabeth Bowman, Lisa Levy, and Kimberly Diane Leach. So he finally admitted to the known murders at that point in time. Now, he's been suspected of killing. These are people he's been suspected of, guys. And yeah. Anne Marie Burr, age 8, in Tacoma, Washington. Remember, in 1961, when he was 14 years old. Now, DNA from her case, I'm not quite sure how they got it, but DNA from her case was tested in 2011. However, it was too insufficient for them to be able to tell if it was Ted or not who had killed her. It was insufficient. It was an insufficient amount. So, regardless, he has also been linked to 2 flight attendants, Lisa E. Wick and Lonnie Trumbull, who were both 20 years old at that point in time. They were bludgeoned with a piece of lumber while they slept on June 3rd of 1966. Lisa, like Karen Sparks and Karen Chandler, Kathy Kleiner, Carol Durant, and Cheryl Thomas, survived. But Lonnie did not. She died from her injuries. And of course, this is something that he did, right? Break into your house and do this while you were sleeping. Interestingly enough, Ted Bundy did work at the grocery store they shopped at, which was fairly close to their apartment. Susan, he's also been suspected of killing Susan Marguerite Davis and Elizabeth Perry, both 20. They were both stabbed to death March 30th of 1969 outside Summers Point, New Jersey, which is about 97 kilometers away from Philadelphia. And if you guys remember, at that point in 1969, remember, he had spent one dismal semester at Temple University, which is in Philadelphia, and they found out that he actually hadn't moved back to Washington until after these murders. He also once told a psychologist that his first kills, of course, he told many people what his first kills were, but anyways, his first victims were two women in the Philadelphia area. He's also been suspected of killing Rita Patricia Curran, 24. She was strangled, bludgeoned, and raped in Burlington, Vermont. The motel she worked to was actually adjacent to the home for unwed mothers that Louise Cowell had given birth to Ted in. And this was in 1971, and of course, Ted was in Vermont in 1971. Joyce LePage, who was 21, she disappeared July 22nd of 1971 from the Washington State campus. Rita Lorraine Jolly, who was 17 and disappeared from Westland, Oregon on June 29th, 1973. Vicki Lynn Haller, 24 years old, disappeared from Eugene, Oregon, August 20th of 1973. These are probably the two unidentified girls he claimed to have killed in Oregon. Oh my God. Lola just gave me the scare of my life. He's also been suspected of killing Brenda Joy Baker, who was 14 and last seen hitchhiking near Puyallup. I hope I said it right. I know it's not Puyallup, it's Puyallup. That's how I was taught to say it. Sorry, I just have to let Lola out of the room. She's gonna keep barking. Go ahead, girl. So he's been suspected of killing her. Now, there is some dissension over the fact that he may or may not have confessed to killing her, actually, before they took him to the electric chair. He may or may not have confessed. Some officers said that he did. Some officers said that he didn't confess to Brenda's death. He's also been suspected of killing Nancy Perry Bard, who was 23, and she disappeared from Layton, Utah on July 4th, 1975, as well as Debbie Smith, who was 17 and disappeared from Salt Lake City in February of 1976. Her body was actually found April 1st of 1976, and of course, possibly many others that he just did not name. I know what you're going to say. Now, in 1976, of course, he was under some police surveillance, but he was also out on bond at that point in time. I just want to point that out. He was free, but not free. So Ted finally rode the white lightning. He finally did it, guys. They got him into Old Sparky on January 24th of 1989. Of course, this is the electric chair. That's what was used. He was terrified, guys. He was terrified to go. But apparently his last words were to tell somebody to tell his family and friends that he loved them. Give my love to my family and friends. I think he just ate a normal prison breakfast that day too. I don't think he got a special menu or anything. Unlike before, when he escaped in Colorado, hundreds, if not thousands of people were celebrating his death outside of Rayford Prison. And they even set off fireworks to mark the date. And he was pronounced dead at 7:16 a.m. that morning. He was then cremated, and his ashes were spread in the Cascade Mountains in Washington as per his will, apparently, in some unidentified spot. Nobody ever said where the spot was. He was 42 years old. His DNA was uploaded into CODIS, the National Data Bank in the States, in 2011. This is in the hopes that either some unidentified doe can be linked to him at some point in time and hopefully be given an identity that way, or just in case they do come across remains that Ted buried someplace so long ago, guys, but buried deep enough that they weren't found until, possibly now or the coming future. That was in the hopes that they would be able to find out if he was guilty of more. So that's it, guys. God, I'm tired now. Are you tired? I'm tired. That's it. That's the case of Ted Bundy. I'm only going to leave you guys with two questions at this point in time. And I do want to say, if you guys want to, of course, I urge you to read The Phantom Prince and also Anne Rule's book, if you already haven't, The Stranger Beside Me. I also just want to show you this last creepy picture. This right here, this is from Bettman Corbis. I just want to show you. That is... They were able to irk him at one point in time during his trial for the Chi Omega girls, they were able to irk him into getting mad. And that's probably the true face, the face of horror that people actually saw when he was murdering them. That is one of the few times they were able to show him angry. So what do you think? How many people do you think that Ted killed? In honesty, guys. I think his total victim count is much higher than the 30 plus they've attributed to him. Most people say it's 36 if you add all the victims together. I fully believe he started as a teen member. He told Liz they're off by years. I believe he started killing in 1961. I believe he started killing when he was a teenager with Anne Marie Burr. He said that in 1974, when they felt he started killing, he was actually at his prime. So think about that. He had to have honed his skills some way. It seems like in times of stress or upheaval, or when things were just not going his way, he tended to take it out on his victims. And he was also acting out fantasies and urges he had at that point in time too. When he was asked by interviewers, by detectives, if 36 sounded like the right number, if 36 was the right number, he allegedly told investigators to, quote, add one digit to that and you'll have it. So what's one digit, guys? Is it the number one? Was it 37? Is it 136? Is it 361? Who can say for sure? Is it 236? Who can say for sure how many actual victims he had? I would guess it would be closer to 100 than we probably would like to believe. I know Bob Keppel and Anne Rule also believed it was closer to 100. Just to let you know, Anne Rule did actually pass away in 2015. It was a really upsetting day for me because she's my favorite true crime writer. And I loved it when she gave interviews and things. She really knew her stuff. And she did pass away in 2015. And actually, Bob Keppel passed away earlier this year. He's one of the few people that was still around that could both talk about Ted Bundy and Gary Ridgway. But he did pass away this year. What do you guys think Ted Bundy was? That's always the question, right? Was he a psychopath? Definitely had elements of psychopathy. Charming, manipulative, easily able to win people over, highly intelligent, very glib, very charming, very charismatic. He definitely had signs of psychopathy. However, unlike a lot of psychopaths, he was actually able to maintain relationships for long periods of time until those relationships weren't useful. With most psychopaths, they only have superficial relationships and they don't last very long. Ted's relationship with Liz was 6 years, 6 to 7 years. No, longer than that. Ted's relationship with Liz was almost a decade. Ted remained friends with Anne Rule for decades, until he finally got angry at her, until they were no longer useful. So that is psychopathy, but he actually had a more meaningful relationship with them, especially Anne. It wasn't so superficial. They definitely had a connection. So that's why I hesitate to say he was fully a psychopath. Was he a sociopath? No. I'm going to talk to you about sociopathy in the way I know it. Most people think psychopathy and sociology are interchangeable. They're not. A true psychopath can't feel empathy and technically doesn't know the difference between right and wrong. They can't feel empathy. They know what's supposed to be right and wrong because it's been taught to them, but they don't have that general instinct within them. There was a study done a long time ago with brains from people that were psychopaths and normal people as well. And when they showed certain images, of course, let's say a horrible car accident, you or I would show up, oh my God, just terrified. Whereas it would take a psychopath a couple seconds for that area of the brain to light up. A different area would light up first. That would prove that they were trying to think for the correct response they were supposed to give. A sociopath can feel empathy if they want to. They do know the difference between right and wrong. They do know when something's horrible. But they choose not to feel it because they don't believe it should apply to them. Sociopaths are also more isolated. They tend not to need other people. They can have relationships. They just, for the most part, choose not to. They're very much individualistic. However, this is the difference to me, guys. It might be different to you guys. However, we know that Ted had a need for people. He didn't like to feel lonely. So being a sociopath, no. Schizophrenia, no. He didn't suffer from schizophrenia. He never heard voices telling him to do things. Dissociative identity disorder, aka multiple personalities. He vehemently denied this. He said he always knew what was going on. He could remember things, and he very much gave it in detail. He was reliving it when he was talking about it. So yes, no dissociative identity disorder. Was he antisocial? Yeah, I think he had certain characteristics of being antisocial. I know there were psychologists that actually did diagnose him that way, and psychiatrists. But I don't know for sure. Like Carla Homolka. Yeah, he was intelligent. He was manipulative, things of that nature. So yes, he definitely showed signs of being antisocial. But at the same point in time, he needed people. He needed people to listen to him, right? He needed people to bounce ideas off. He just didn't seem like he could stay alone very much. Did he have personality disorder? Yeah, this is the last one, I swear. I think, yeah, he definitely showed signs of, well, some people tried to say that he was diagnosed as bipolar. I don't think that that's a correct diagnosis either, because he did not have the mania and the depression like we would understand it to be. Yeah, there were times, especially like in Florida, where it seemed that he was manic, but he didn't suffer from, I'm sure he had days when he was down, but he didn't suffer from crippling depression where he couldn't get out of bed or anything like that, guys. So I don't think that he was bipolar or manic depressive. I do think that he had borderline personality disorder. We talked about this with Eileen Wernos. If you want to go in and look at that video, guys, it explains it a little bit better. But with the fact that he can manipulate people with borderline personality disorder can do that. With the fact that he tended never to blame himself for anything that went on. It was either the victim's or somebody else's fault, not his. The fact that he was so impulsive, he couldn't control his stealing. And a lot of people with borderline personality disorder are impulsive in some aspect of their life, be it shopping frenzies, be it going out and being sexually promiscuous, be it anything like that. There's some impulse. The fact that he could get raging, angry 1 minute, which a lot of people that he only showed that side of himself to his victims. I want to point that out, guys. Whereas a true borderline will just show it when they're provoked. But he could be angry 1 minute and then the next minute he was fine. It was like it never happened. Remember, he killed 2 girls in one day and then took Liz out for burgers afterwards. I do definitely think he has various pieces of borderline personality disorder, particularly abandonment. He always wanted to make sure nobody was ever going to leave him. It devastated him when Stephanie Brooks left him. He would often ask Liz, "You're not going to leave me, are you? Like, I hope you don't leave me. Will we be together forever?" Things of that nature. I think this had to do with the fact that he was, as a child, abandoned by his parents to some extent. Remember, he was taken away by his sister, who was actually his mother, from Sam and Eleanor Cowell. And he deeply loved them, so he would have felt that. Or he claims he deeply loved them, particularly his grandfather. We're going to get into that in a second. So he did have issues with abandonment. Remember, he couldn't be alone. So that's why it sounds like he's a little bit more borderline personality to me than some of the other diagnoses he's been given. I don't know if he was ever, some sources say he was diagnosed that way, but I'm not 100% certain because they didn't actually start diagnosing people with this until fairly recently. And they also, it's still controversial and there's still a very big stigma attached to it. It's one of the hardest mental health issues to treat is borderline personality disorder. There is no cure for it either. But dialectic behavioral therapy has been proven to help with it, especially talking about your experiences with a group of people. It makes you feel less abandoned. But he did have abandonment issues, particularly probably stemming from Stephanie Brooks. That's could be why he killed people that looked a lot like her. However, I believe he started killing long before that, and I believe the person he was targeting, that he was killing in his mind, was probably more along the lines of his mother. But that's just my way of saying it. I also believe that with borderline personality disorder, you have to have something traumatic that happened to you in childhood for it to be diagnosed. This trauma could be neglect. It could be abuse. When we're talking about neglect, it's fairly severe neglect. It could be emotional abandonment. It could be outright abandonment, things of that nature. And we don't know what happened to Ted Bundy when he lived with Sam and Eleanor Cowell. If you'll remember, he did move away from them when he was 4.5. And he describes his relationship and his grandfather as very good. However, many other family members of Louise Cowell, not her herself, but many others, said that he was an abusive tyrant. So we have no idea what he did to Ted, or what he may have shown Ted, or what may have gone on in that household. We do know he was abusive to animals. What did Ted learn? What trauma? I'm just saying that that's seemingly likely. If I had to pick, I would say he's narcissistic for sure. I would say he's psychopathic for sure. And I would also say that he has elements of borderline personality disorder. Those are just my thoughts, though. Let me know your thoughts. Tell me down below what you think. Next week, we're going back to Canada, guys. I've got a couple cases I'm thinking about doing. So hopefully you will join me then, and I will see you next time. Bye for now, guys.
Mommy.